the Gentle Rebel podcast.
For introverts, highly sensitive people, and creative misfits.
Hello, welcome to the Gentle Rebel podcast. My name is Andy Mort, and this is a weekly show committed to help unite your inner Stoic and your quiet sensitivity so that you can design a rewarding and a creative life and change the world from the inside out without getting overwhelmed. How's it going? I'm a little bit late on getting this episode out, I'm afraid. It's been one of those weeks this week, one of those unpredictable, those testing the Stoic metal kind of weeks. I've been on call, which for those of you who don't know, I'm an undertaker, part-time undertaker. We're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So whenever someone dies, we kind of go out and we take them back into our care at the funeral home. And since starting the job, part-time job, as I say, I've never known a week quite like this one. I think we were out overnight altogether for more than 20, it was about 22 hours or so. And the area that we cover has recently been doubled in size by the powers that be. So one night I was out and about for 12 hours, drove more than 150 miles in the middle of the night after working through the day, the previous day. So, yes, questions to be asked, but, I've been out for at least 4 hours every single night, except for last night, which is nice because today is my birthday. So, a full night's sleep genuinely felt like the best gift that I could have been given when I woke up this morning. So, it's been one of those. I've felt kind of pretty jet lagged this week. You get that kind of sense. You have all these intentions to do things. I've had intentions to do a lot of work on the podcast, to do some stuff with the business, but I've been functioning at about 30% of my normal level. Trying to remember all that stuff that I talk about self-care and being gentle with yourself and all of that. And yeah, it's that tough thing where I've tried to sleep, I've tried to rest, but can't manage any more than short naps, which I think my body has been well trained in. Like a quick power nap after lunch, 25 minutes, that's it. And my body's like, oh, it's day outside. That must mean we need to enter nap mode. And I've been unable to find the kind of override function of nap mode. So I'm stuck in it. So I cannot sleep for any longer than about 25 minutes through the day. And it's given my head that weird kind of fuzzy feeling, like a hangover without the regret. That kind of white noisy stuff in my ear. I don't know if this is something that anybody else gets, but a weird feature of tiredness for me is a kind of a constant hiss just in the background in my ears. And then, yeah, some feeling in the pit of my stomach that kind of rises into my head anytime I sit down to do anything remotely productive, or constructive. It's like one of those hammer things that you get at the fairground, where you whack it and the thing shoots up the thermostat and you try and hit the bell or whatever. That's how I felt this week. Distracted by anything and everything, which smack the target, go flying up into my head, ring the bell, and I'm doing something else. Or mindlessly scrolling through Facebook. That's pretty much been the extent of it. Anyway, that's been the story of my week. And I'm over the moon to be awake and to be functioning after some proper sleep. Happy days.
If you enjoy this podcast and you'd like more, there's a simple way to show support. It takes me loads of hours each week to make sure that every show's complete. I love to write, record and share, and it's really nice to know you care. The best way, and it don't take long, is to become a Patreon. So visit andymott.com/Patreon. There are 4 levels you can choose from. Each one unlocks a ton of fun. If you become a Patreon, I'll say your name at the end of this song. Visit andymott.com/Patreon. Patreon.
The insurmountable, incredible, inspirational Josie George, thank you so much for supporting the Gentle Rebel podcast over the past week, or just over a week ago, I think. Yeah, it's great to have you on board. And for everybody else, go and follow Josie on Twitter. She is at Porridge Brain, and she's one of the most heartwarming, positive voices on there. She's using Twitter in a way that I would say it was designed to be used to make the world better, to connect people in positive ways, to talk about things in genuinely transformational and non-polarizing ways, and to change the world from the inside out. That's about it. Thank you so much, Josie. Speaking of changing things from the inside out, it is time for me to introduce this week's special guest. As you'll know, if you've been listening for a while, I've been drawn more and more into Stoic philosophy over the past year or so, and kind of found it really, really helpful in dealing with certain things. And I'm massively interested in how sensitive types and introverts can live in conjunction with its principles in order to bring our best selves to the world and into our lives, and all the other stuff like our relationships and the things that we're creating and all that sort of stuff. And one of the voices I have come across time and time again in this journey of discovery is Massimo Pigliucci, who writes a lot about Stoicism. He runs a Patreon page called Footnotes on Plato, and he's written a book called How to Be a Stoic, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living, which is very, very good, and I highly recommend getting into. It's like a kind of discourse between him and Epictetus, which works perfectly as a way to introduce the principles of Stoicism. And I sent Massimo an email a little while ago, just kind of asking whether he would be up for doing an interview. And I was kind of actually surprised and delighted when he agreed to do it. I've learned so much from, reading his stuff, reading his book, and now from getting to speak to him as well. It was just so good. And I become more and more convinced the more I get into this stuff of how much this can steer the ship of our lives in a better, a happier and a gentle direction, especially as highly sensitive and introverted people.
Massimo Pigliucci, the voice on Stoic philosophy, ideas on the good life, and how to set your mind right. Another footnote to what Plato wrote, the old noble tradition of philosophical wisdom. Another footnote to what Plato spoke, true application in a modern situation. Massimo Pigliucci, the voice on Stoic philosophy, ideas on a good life, and how to set your mind right.
Massimo Pigliucci, it is so wonderful to be joined by you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much.
Great. So let's start with, getting into the basics. As one of the absolute leading voices on the subject today, I have to start by asking you the question, what is Stoicism, and how is it different from other schools of philosophy?
Right. So you want the elevator pitch, which I'm still working on.
Excellent.
It's a philosophy, so it's not easy to give an elevator speech. But still, let me try my best. So Stoicism is an ancient Greek-Roman philosophy, which is kind of similar in my mind to Buddhism in terms of its ethics. In fact, I think of it as sort of the Western equivalent to Buddhism, even though their metaphysics are very different. But basically what it is, it's a framework for how to navigate life, for setting priorities, for having a sense of what the world is about, and particularly for having a sense of how to operate in the world, how to behave, especially with respect to other people. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much a description of any philosophy of life. or in fact any religion for that matter. What Stoicism has in particular is that it is a kind of virtue ethics. So it's based on the idea that the most important thing in people's lives is to behave ethically. And according to the Stoics, what that means is to practice constantly 4 cardinal virtues, which are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the knowledge of what is truly good for you and what is truly bad for you. And if you want, we can talk about that because it's a rather unusual concept. Mm-hmm. You would be surprised what is truly good or bad for you according to the Stoics. The second virtue is courage, which is really not the kind of physical courage, rushing into battle or something like that or into danger, but moral courage, the courage to do the right thing. The virtue of justice tells you what the right thing to do is with respect to others. And the virtue of temperance tells you that you should do everything in right measure, not too little and not too much. So these are the basic ideas. There is a lot more to be said, but that's basically the idea, that if you use these 4 cardinal virtues as your compass basically to navigate life, then you're going to have what the ancient Greeks and Romans called the eudaimonic life, a life that is actually worth living.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, just going back to where you parked a little bit there, what are the things that are truly good for you and truly bad for you?
Right. So most people would think that things like, let's say, being wealthy is good and being poor is bad, or that being healthy is good and being sick is bad, and so on. And being educated is good and being uneducated is bad, and so on and so forth. Or being in a relationship is good, although that depends on the relationship. And being on your own is bad, that sort of stuff. Yeah. The Stoics didn't buy that. And the reason they didn't buy that is because all of those things are ultimately outside of your control. You can influence them, of course. Let's talk about health for a second. Of course, you can influence your health, right? You can eat right. You can go to the gym and exercise or whatever it is. But ultimately, a virus can strike you dead in a minute, or an accident can break a leg, or whatever it is, or your genes can play a trick on you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So the idea is that a number of things that people normally think of as good or bad are actually, in fact, ultimately outside of our control. And so the Stoics said, okay, if you want to be happy, then you should really focus on the things that are under your control, because there you can determine by yourself whether to be happy or not. It's only up to you. So what are these things that are entirely under your control? The list is very short. It's basically only about your judgments, your opinions, and your chosen values. And that's about it, right? So the Stoics derive from this the idea that what is truly good for you is to have good judgment, good opinions, and good values. And what is truly bad for you is to have bad judgment, bad opinions, and bad values, right? And so you can train yourself in changing and shifting those 3 things, and the more you shift them from the bad to the good, the happier you're going to be.
Cool. Simple.
Yeah, right. Well, the theory is simple. The practice, not quite.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely.
Because it takes a lot of time.
Yeah. How did you come to focus so much on the kind of Stoic teachings in your own life and work as well? Because you're a professor of philosophy generally, aren't you? So,
right. I am a professor of philosophy, although my specialty is philosophy of science, not ancient philosophy. Okay. So don't put me on, ancient Greek, because that's not my specialty. I just trust what the experts tell me. But practical philosophy, modern philosophy, does require a degree in philosophy in order to be practical. And the way I got into it is because I was going a few years ago through a sort of a midlife crisis, which is normal for a middle-aged, man. Yep. And I felt like I needed some kind of framework. I grew up when I was little in Italy, in Rome. I grew up Catholic. That gave me the framework at the time. Mm-hmm. But I abandoned the church by age 15 or 16 or thereabout. After that, I consider myself essentially a secular humanist. And secular humanism is fine, except that it increasingly looked to me not really like a philosophy, but a shopping list of things that I liked. Right. So if you look up secular humanism, very likely the kind of thing you're going to find is one version or another, or of what is called the Secular Humanist Manifesto. And if you read the manifesto, that's what it reads like. It reads like a list of things that you agree with, right? And it's fine, but it's not really a philosophy of life. It doesn't really tell you why you should like those things rather than other, how to go about actually implementing this stuff and so on. So I felt like I needed something more. I was reading philosophy because that was also the period of my life a few years ago when I was shifting career from biology to philosophy. My first academic career was in evolutionary biology.
Right.
And once you start reading philosophy as a graduate student, it's inevitable that you start reading ethics and you start reading, Plato and things like that. As soon as I did that, it was pretty much immediately clear to me that the answer was going to be, or at least an answer that would work for me, was going to be in the area of virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is a broad sort of set of ethical systems. It includes Aristotle or Epicurus, Plato, of course, and a bunch of others, including the Stoics. Mm-hmm. So I had the sense that virtue ethics was where I needed to go. And when you get that sense, the first stop usually is Aristotle. And Aristotle is great, but it didn't really click with me. Okay. There were a number of things that Aristotle said that just didn't sound right. For instance, he said that in order to have a eudaimonic life, a life, a flourishing, worth living, virtue is important, but you also need a little bit of luck. You need, education and wealth and, and health and a little bit of even good looks. Otherwise, you're screwed. And I said, that can't be right. That's to eliminate, to exclude the majority, essentially, of the world population on the basis of that criteria. That doesn't sound right. So the next stop was Epicurus. And Epicureanism has a lot going for it. In particular, its emphasis on a minimalist lifestyle. The idea that you need very few things, very few externals, in order to be happy. There is a focus on friendship and love. So those things are very good. Unfortunately, however, the Epicureans thought that the good life was a life where you avoid pain, especially mental, emotional pain, which meant to them that you should stay away from social and especially political life. Because as we all know these days, that's pretty painful. Mm-hmm. And I thought, no, that's not going to do it for me. It's like, I can't imagine living a full life without social political engagement. That doesn't sound right. So I was in that kind of situation. Virtue ethics is where it is, but it's not going to be Aristotle. It's not going to be Epicurus. Now what? Yeah. That day, not that day, but in that period, I saw something on my Twitter feed that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I said, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate it? But I was curious because, of course, I remember that the Stoics were also a type of, Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics. So I said, you know what, maybe I should look into this. So I signed up. I practice as a Stoic for a week, which is what the whole thing is about. It happens every October or November during every year. You sign up, you fill out a bunch of questionnaires, then you download material about the Stoics and Stoic philosophy, and you basically practice for a week. At the end of that week, I thought, this clicks. This is really where I need to go, and especially because I started reading Epictetus, who was entirely unknown to me at the time. It's like, which is weird because Epictetus was a very famous philosopher throughout the ages until the end of the 19th century. And then it kind of got into an eclipse at the beginning of the 20th century. People say, in part at least, because of the onset of so-called analytical philosophy. People like Bertrand Russell and G. Moore and things like that. Russell was not particularly sympathetic to Stoicism, for instance. And I knew about other Stoics. When I went to school in high school in Italy, you had to study philosophy for 3 years, and you also have to study Latin for 8 years. Right? So I translated Seneca and I read Marcus Aurelius, but I just didn't make the connection. And Epictetus wasn't on the horizon. As soon as I started reading Epictetus, I had this kind of,
that was the
wow,
thing. Yeah,
that really clicked. And so I started studying more seriously. I devoted, I committed for another couple of months initially, and then for another year, and then now here we are, several years later, still doing it.
Wow. What are some of the? Because me coming to Stoicism for the first time had a few ideas around the word Stoic, about what it meant, which involved some misconceptions. I'm wondering if you can identify any misconceptions around Stoicism in Western society, and why you think it's worth redefining how we think of it. I think you've mentioned in your book the kind of Mr. Spock model of Stoicism and how that confuses things a bit.
Right. I think there are fundamentally three common misconceptions about Stoicism that are really pernicious, because they really sort of twist the philosophy into something that it isn't. The first one is that Stoics are into sort of eliminating emotions, right? So that's the Mr. Spock kind of model.
Yeah.
The second one, which is related, is that you go through life. You're supposed to go through life with a stiff upper lip, right? So it's all about endurance. It's all about this, being strong and manly. And that's the third misconception, that it's mostly a man kind of thing, because after all, the Latin word for virtue, it's ver, which is the same meaning as man.
Okay.
Right. So I think that those three are all fundamentally mistaken and create problems if people don't understand where the mistake is. So let's take them quickly, one at a time. So first of all, the emotion stuff. The Stoics were not about suppressing emotions, but there is some, like every misconception, there is some truth underlying it, and then it gets so twisted away. So here's the truth. The idea was that what you want to do is to shift the normal emotional spectrum away from unhealthy and destructive emotions and toward healthy, constructive emotions. In fact, the Stoics had two different words for those kinds of emotions. The pate were the destructive emotions. That's the root of the word pathology in English. Yeah. So clearly something that you want to stay away from. And the eupateiai are the positive emotions. So an example of a negative emotion would be anger. You don't want to be angry. Angry is not a good thing for you. It leads you, even if it is justified anger, there's actually been some injustice. If you let yourself be controlled by anger, you're likely going to do something stupid or something ineffective or something you're going to regret. A positive emotion, example of positive emotion, on the other hand, would be joy or love, or even a sense of justice. They counted a sense of justice as a type of positive emotion. So the first point is that the idea was not to suppress emotions, but to move away from the negative one and nurture the positive ones. The second point, the one about going through life with a stiff upper lip, is again, there is a basis of truth there. Endurance is, in fact, part of the Stoic ethos. The idea is that certain things you cannot control, and so what are you going to do? You just have to deal with them, right? But the idea there is not that, first of all, it's not that everything you don't control. There are some things you can control, and there are some things that you can affect, even if you don't control them, and you should. So if there is an injustice, if something bad is being done, you should try to do something about it, but you should always remind yourself that you might not succeed. So more than stiff upper lip, the idea is to develop equanimity toward outcomes. You always try to do your best, but then you accept that sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. And if you don't succeed, you just move on and do the next thing, right? You don't cry over it. You don't sort of it's like, what's the point of despairing yourself over something that you cannot do anything about it? I mean, this is to some extent kind of commonsensical, right? There is an English saying, it's like, what's the sense of crying over spilled milk? Yeah. Well, that's the idea, right? If the milk is spilled, that's it. Yeah. All you can do is to clean it up and get another glass. There's nothing else to do about it. The third idea, the manliness stuff, it's true, of course, that the Latin virtue does also mean man. But ver is the translation of the Greek arete, and arete means just excellence. And there's no reason on earth why the only people that can be excellent at something are men rather than women. In fact, one of the things that I like about the Stoics is that they were very clear. Many of them wrote about women. Seneca did, Epictetus did, Musonius Rufus, who was Epictetus' teacher, and even Zeno of Citium, who was the founder of the philosophy. And they all were very clear about this. They said, women participate in the logos, that in other words, they are capable of rationality just as men are, and therefore they should be treated accordingly, and they should be taught philosophy. They are capable of learning philosophy. They're capable of living a virtuous life. So there it is. It's very clear in the Stoic writings. There's really no reason to put an emphasis on men as opposed to women. Mm-hmm. So those are the three major misconceptions, I think, and it's a good idea to clear the air out of those things.
Yeah, great. In terms of, if you're talking about this to your students, do you find certain types of people gravitate towards it more than others?
Yes, that is definitely the case. I wish there were sociological studies out there about, let's say, in fact, some people, some colleagues that I know are actually beginning to look into correlation between personalities, psychological personalities,
right,
and responsiveness to Stoic philosophy.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I don't think that Stoicism necessarily is for everybody, or maybe it doesn't speak to everybody at any particular moment in their lives. Like, it's very possible that if you had exposed me to Stoicism 20 years ago, I would say, what the hell is this thing, right? So you have to be in the right place in the right moment. I do think that some people respond more naturally to Stoicism. As I said earlier, for me, it just clicked immediately. Yeah. And I've heard that story many, many times. Lots of people that read my book or read my blog write to me and say, yeah, as soon as I discovered this, or sometimes you hear, I've been doing this for a long time and I didn't know that there was an entire philosophy based on it. That said, it probably is not a bad idea for anybody who is curious about the notion of a philosophy of life to explore Stoicism, at least to give it a go. It may not work for you, but it may. You may be surprised. In fact, I've just finished putting together an anthology with two colleagues of mine, Sky Cleary and Dan Kaufman, which is going to be published next year. And it's going to come out as by Vintage Random House. And the anthology is 14 chapters by 14 different people. Most of them are philosophers, but not all. And each chapter is about a different philosophy or religion. And these are written by people who actually live that philosophy or religion. Right? So the idea is to give a sampler. And it's like, you'll find Stoicism, but also Aristotelianism. You'll find Buddhism, Confucianism. You'll find Christianity, existentialism, secular humanism, Taoism, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And the idea is precisely most of us grow up within a particular tradition. As I said, I grew up in Rome, so obviously I was a Catholic, not surprisingly. Yeah. But sometimes you stay in that tradition because it works for you. Sometimes you stay in it out of inertia. You just don't want to bother looking at other things. Sometimes you stay in it because of social pressure. Other people tell you that, you should stay in it. But sometimes you might want to look around and say, let me take a look here. What else is available here? And after all, people have been thinking about how to live a meaningful life for 2 or 3 millennia. So there is a lot out there to sample.
That would be really interesting. Yeah, I can't wait to read that. I'd love to know what you think of the kind of, there's a resurgence, I feel, of Stoicism that has been happening. It's a slow burn for me over the past probably 4 or 5 years. I've heard the word more and more, and I engaged in the subject. I had one of those things of a bit of an aha moment reading Ryan Holiday's Daily Stoic book, which I think a lot of people have probably come into it via some of the stuff that Ryan Holiday's doing. I know there are others in the kind of online marketing and business space who've taken Stoicism to heart as well. I'd absolutely love to get your thoughts on, this kind of area, how, Stoicism and business. What do you think of that sort of, thing?
I am somewhat skeptical about it, but only somewhat. So I know Ryan, and we've met several times. He actually was. I invited him as a keynote speaker to New York City Stoicon a couple of years ago, right? And I read a couple of his books, so including the Daily Stoic. And he knows what he's talking about. I mean, he clearly has read his stuff. He's not superficial about stuff.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there is a danger there of going too much for the sort of techniques, basically, treating Stoicism as a bag of tricks, essentially, and not really as a philosophy. Now, I don't think Ryan does that, actually. I think that Ryan is an actual practitioner of Stoicism.
Yeah.
But there are other people out there, I will not mention names, who are going more and more for the trick stuff, the bag of trick stuff. Now, that in and of itself, it's neither unusual, not necessarily problematic, as long as you know what you're doing. So, for instance, again, I made the parallel with Buddhism, right? Well, a lot of people these days, especially in the West, practice meditation techniques that doesn't make them Buddhists.
Yeah.
Right. So, because in order to be a Buddhist, to practice Buddhism, you actually have to follow the ethics. Right. You may or may not buy into the metaphysics. I mean, there are secular Buddhists, for instance, who don't. But you definitely have to practice the ethics. You have to practice things like, non-attachment and, right reason and right speech and so on and so forth. If you don't do that, then you're not a Buddhist. But you can not be a Buddhist and still get benefits from meditation, from different kinds of meditative techniques. I mean, the same goes with Stoicism. So, yes, it can be useful as a set of techniques for whatever you do, not just business, but anything in life, really. I mean, it's not what you were asking about the reasons for the resurgence of Stoicism. Certainly one of those reasons is the fact that Stoicism directly inspired a set of cognitive behavioral therapies at the beginning of the 1950s and 60s. So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, all of those started explicitly, influenced by Stoicism. Right. The early practitioners of those therapies actually had read and were inspired by Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and so on. So, and those clearly work as techniques. I mean, they're pretty evidence-based, as we say these days. I mean, there's a lot of empirical evidence that actually backs up those techniques. But it's not like because you go to CBT and as a client, you are therefore a Stoic. Yeah. You're just using some techniques that are derived from Stoicism. Of course, CBT now it's evolved into a lot larger, larger set of techniques. But nonetheless, and that can work for you. That doesn't make you a Stoic, however. So as long as we're clear about the distinction between the techniques themselves, which can be taken on their own, and they are useful on their own, and the philosophy, which of course includes the techniques, but it's much broader, then I think we're fine. Then I don't think there's a problem. But if you try to pass the techniques for Stoicism, then I think you're mixing things that really don't need to be mixed. It would be like somebody who does meditation say, "I'm a Buddhist." Well, no, you're not.
Yeah. Because one of the things that I was struck by because The Obstacle is the Way was the last book that I read by Ryan. And some of the examples that he uses of people displaying sort of, I suppose, Stoic techniques or habits. But you're thinking there's the whole package isn't quite there when talking about sort of Margaret Thatcher and Steve Jobs and people like that. And I suppose, what you're saying about the ethical side of things, there's
I would definitely not consider, I don't want to get into politics because that's, I have my own ideas about Thatcher, but we don't need to go there. But let's take Steve Jobs. Yeah. Definitely not a Stoic. No. Absolutely. I read his biography. No, there's no way. The guy wasn't into practicing virtue. He was actually significantly unethical in certain respects. Yes, brilliant businessman for sure. Nobody doubts that, right? But no, he was definitely not a Stoic. And so that's exactly the problem with some of the examples that Ryan brings up, which is those are more examples of techniques working, but certainly they're not example of Stoicism. If your main goal in life is to make money or to become wealthy or to become famous or anything like that, then you're definitely not a Stoic. Yeah. For Stoics are very clear about this. All of those things are preferred indifference. There's nothing. Stoicism is not against wealth. It's not against making money. It's not against any of that sort of material stuff. so long as that is a secondary thing in your life, and so long as it doesn't get into your way of practicing virtue, so it doesn't make you an unvirtuous person, right? Epictetus is very nice. It has a very nice phrase at the beginning of the Discourses where he says, "So you got the money. What are you going to do with the money? The money isn't going to tell you, right?" So and Seneca said something similar. He says, it's fine to be wealthy so long as you acquire that wealth in a virtuous way, and so long as you use it in a virtuous way. Mm-hmm. Steve Jobs definitely did not do that. So I don't think of him as a Stoic.
Okay. It's interesting. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that. So just before we end, have you got any sort of good book recommendations? Anything that you'd recommend people maybe starting out on this road if they're interested in discovering a little bit more?
It's a little embarrassing. So first, I'm gonna suggest my book.
I would second that, definitely.
Yeah, How to Be a Stoic, because it was written precisely for that kind of audience. It was written to be interesting to people that are beginning or that have started, but they want a different kind of perspective on things. The book is a series of imaginary dialogues that I have with Epictetus, in fact. And it covers all sorts of topics from, friendship and love to depression and loneliness and, things like that. So that's certainly one possibility. I would say in a few months there is this new book by Don Robertson that's coming out. It's called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And it's focused on Marcus Aurelius. It's an interesting book about using Marcus' life as a way to see how one can become a Stoic in practice. And so I think that's a very interesting approach that Don used for it. Bill Irvine's book on Stoic joy is also very good, although you need to be careful there because Bill occasionally veers toward Epicureanism, and so what you're reading is kind of a mix of Epicureanism. So you need to be careful. So those are the obvious ones that come to mind. I also would say read the primary sources, because one of the things is we do have a good amount of primary sources, mostly from the so-called late Stoa, that is the Stoics from the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we have nothing or next to nothing from the very early Stoics. But precisely, I think, in part because of this resurgence of Stoicism in popular culture, a lot of academics have been retranslating and getting out new commentaries about the Stoics. So there is a really nice book by Anthony Long on Epictetus and Socratic philosophy, which is definitely worth reading. It's not an academic book. It's a really good introduction to Epictetus and to Socrates. And there is a wonderful collection by the University of Chicago Press of all of the complete works by Seneca. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, 7 or 8 volumes of it. I would start with the letters on ethics, which I think are a wonderful book to read. It's just beautiful language. Seneca writes really beautifully. There are also new translations of the Meditations. There's my favorite one is by Robin Hard, published by Oxford World's Classics, and a new translation of Epictetus, also by Robin Hard, also for Oxford World's Classics. So there is a lot of stuff out there. And of course, there's blogs. You can go to the Modern Stoicism blog, for instance, to find lots of interesting articles. You can get to my blog at Patreon. It's called Plato Footnotes, and find lots and lots of materials. And finally, I would suggest there's a number of podcasts out there, and there is a large Facebook community with more than 40,000 members, where you can just log in and ask any question you want about Stoicism, and somebody will answer it.
Fantastic. So much stuff to get to dig into there. Thank you so much, Massimo. It's been really great just chatting with you today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Words, I had words. I had so many words that I wanted to say, but when I opened my mouth, they all went away. Give me a week and I will write you a letter, because my words on the page seem to come out much better than the words from my mouth when I'm speaking aloud, and I'm trying to be saving and clever and proud. Points, I have points. I have so many points that pavement. I trip and I fall because I'm down in the mouth where I hit the wall. I gobbledygook, roller skates, tripping on my words and smashing into gates. My gobbledygook, roller skates, hitting the curves and my gobbledygook, roller skates, tripping on my words and smashing into gates. My gobbledygook, roller skates, my head is a curve and this is no plan. This is no plan. Oh, for goodness sake. Not making any sense to me.
Thank you so much to Massimo Pigliucci for joining me this week. I really hope that you got a lot out of that interview. It was so insightful. It was one of those that I got more out of going back and editing the video because I got to listen again and again. This episode is available on YouTube as well, so you can watch the interview if you want to do that that way. To see what it looked like. It's funny how you miss things the first time round. That happens time and time again when I do interviews. You know, even in the midst of a conversation, you don't truly hear what is being said by the other person. Especially when you're thinking about next questions or how you're going to respond to something that they've said or whatever. You know, there's that kind of thing that people say about, you know, you need to truly listen rather than most of us just spend conversations waiting to be able to react or to be able to respond to what the other person's saying, not truly engaging, not truly listening to what it is that they say. And I wonder how much we miss in most of our conversations a lot of the time when we're doing that, and how often we, you know, think something has been said by the other person, but really, if we were to go back and listen again, we would actually realize that it wasn't what was said that we remember, but what we heard through our own interpretation of what we said and how we filtered the things that was said by the other person. So, yeah, all that to say, I recommend going back and listening to conversations, to interviews, more than once, because you probably did miss things the first time round. So just before we go, I want to mention the new course that I created fairly recently as an introduction to Stoicism for sensitive types. It's a kind of good way in to all of this stuff, especially through that lens of high sensitivity. We don't have an option to turn off life's unexpected twists and turns. The world can feel harsh and unrelenting at times, you know, throwing one thing after another into our path when frankly we've already got enough on our plates to deal with. We might feel like we're making good progress on something, and then suddenly, out of the blue, bang, something happens and we're derailed. The seemingly smallest things can have the biggest impact if they happen at the wrong time. You know, someone criticizing you, the envy that you might experience when you see somebody else succeeding. You know, you're scrolling through Instagram and you see someone and you feel that sense of envy. Being in an unfamiliar place, feeling like an outsider. This is where instinct kicks in and we resort to default actions that, you know, it might be to give up. It might be to retreat and to hide, to isolate yourself from the world. Maybe you climb into bed and you hope that someone else is going to sort everything out. You pray for a miracle intervention. Perhaps you beat yourself up. You relive situations and conversations in your mind where you wish you'd done something or said something differently. Alternatively, you might channel this stuff by lashing out, by getting angry, by engaging in kind of destructive knee-jerk reactions. You become volatile and unpredictable. You know, this is the kind of person that you know has had a bad day because they take it out on other people who have nothing to do with what made the day bad. Usually the people closest to them. Well, I created the Sensitive Stoic course to help quiet, sensitive, creative types like you and me change some of these reactions, some of these narratives, these stories. If you've resigned yourself to the belief that you're somehow flawed and will never be as resilient as other people, it's time to think again. By learning to become a sensitive Stoic, you'll begin to identify the sources that feed your destructive reactions so that you can take control. You can move from unhealthy, kind of quicksand sinking reactions to a place of healthy, rock solid initiation where you're confident in your ability to cope with just about anything. You prepare yourself for those inevitable times when things don't go as planned and become strong in the face of all manner of adversity and change. You implement the core principles and disciplines of Stoicism without thinking. This becomes your new default reaction, and find a fresh sense of perspective in order to act on those things that currently derail you. You'll start to speak a whole new language about emotion and about your general well-being and the things that you allow to influence and even control those things. And we unpack this stuff through a series of 9 video lessons, as well as interviews as we kind of meet other sensitive Stoics who have overcome all kinds of obstacles and gained new perspectives and Stoic tools along the way from all kinds of unexpected places. These things to strengthen their resilience in the face of the situations that used to immobilize them. There's a link in the show notes to join the course, or alternatively, just go to andymort.com/sensitive stoic, and you can join the course that way. Right away, you get instant access to everything. So, I recommend doing that if this is something that is kind of tickling your fancy as a kind of life philosophy. So, that's all I've got to say. Thank you so much for listening today. Just before we go, love to ask a big favour. The best thing that you can do to support the podcast in general, other than becoming a patron through Patreon, as I sang about earlier, is to rate and comment on this show in your chosen podcast application, wherever you're listening to this right now, whether that's through Apple or Stitcher or Google or wherever. If you could just take a minute to search for the Gentle Rebel podcast there, to leave a quick 5-star rating. 4-star ratings okay, but 5 stars the best. That would be amazing. Just helps to get this show and previous episodes of it into more of the ears of people searching for help, support, encouragement, and all of that good stuff with these topics that we explore each week. I'd be very grateful if you could do that. Right, thank you very much. I will be back again next week with another episode of the Gentle Rebel podcast. Until then, do remember that you are an artist, that the world needs your art. Now go and make somebody's day. Goodbye.